Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for attending the latest in a series of public events in 2021 by the Michael V. Hayden Center for Intelligence, Policy, and International Security here at George Mason University. I am Mark Rozelle. I serve as the Dean of the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University, and we are very proud to host the Hayden Center. Mason's president, Greg Washington, likes to say that these Hayden Center virtual events are George Mason's equivalent to must-see TV. And judging from the turnout for these events, clearly many people agree. Now tonight, we have over 600 persons who have signed up from 45 states, the District of Columbia, 6 continents, 17 countries, and 32 universities. So welcome to all of you from around the world. The Hayden Center, of course, honors its founder, General Michael Hayden, who has been on our faculty now for 11 years. And I noticed, by the way, that someone on Twitter not long ago asked General Hayden his current status, and he replied, retired. Now, just to be clear, in retirement, he has written 2 best-selling books, been a national security analyst on CNN, lectured around the world, among many other ventures, and founded our Hayden Center, and has been a frequent moderator, panelist, and always participant on our many programs. So may your retirement be so full as his. We are fortunate to have many leading scholars and practitioner teachers in our International Security Studies master's degree program. Professor Ellen Lapson is the program director. She's done a fantastic job in building it into one of the most highly ranked in this field in the country. And recently we have added to our teaching capacity Andrew McCabe, the director of the FBI, David Priest, PhD in political science and COO of Lawfare, as well as longtime intelligence analyst and White House intelligence briefer, and also Ronald Marks, longtime CIA officer and staff member on the Hill. But to also welcome tonight's event, I do want to turn to the founder of the Hayden Center, General Michael Hayden. General?
Thank you again. Representative Adam Schiff, thank you again for being here. It's really going to be a wonderful evening. And by the way, you did so many things. Thank you again from CIA, NSA, and so on. Thank you again. Michael Morell will moderate, and Larry, let's begin.
Thank you, General. Great to have you here again tonight, and welcome to the chairman, and welcome Michael Morell. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Hayden Center, we've been around for a little over 3 years, and we were set up to try to demystify the intelligence profession, the role it plays in policymaking for a lot of our students and for really the general public. It's an area that is shrouded in a lot of mystery, and we felt, General Hayden felt it was important to try to get out there and make it a little more explainable and a little more sensible to folks. We put on lots of events. That's our main line of business. If you've missed our events in the past, we do have a YouTube channel. Go to Hayden Center on YouTube, and you can find 3 years worth of events that touch on all aspects of intelligence. If you want to hear about our events first, get on our mailing list. You can just go to our Hayden Center website, haydencenter.gmu.edu. Scroll to the bottom of the page, put your email address in, hit return, and you'll be hearing from us about events. Some administrative points. After we get through this great conversation we're going to have, Michael is going to turn to you in the audience for your questions. So start thinking of your questions, start sending your questions to us. The way to get them to us is using the Q&A tool in your Zoom window. There is a chat tool in the Zoom window. We will not be monitoring the chat tool, so don't send your questions there. Send them to the Q&A tool. If you're watching us on our YouTube live stream, you can use the chat function in YouTube live stream, and we'll monitor that for questions as well. We are going to be recording the event. We are recording the event. The event will then be put on our YouTube channel and other social media. But we also are recording the event for use by Michael Morell in his podcast that is carried by CBS News and CBS News Radio. It's called Intelligence Matters. Again, a wonderful vehicle for learning about all things intelligence and national security. Thanks to Michael and CBS for allowing that to take place. If you do not wish your name to be used in your question because we're recording, please make sure to indicate that you want to remain anonymous with your question. We're on social media. We're on Twitter. So go on Twitter, comment about the event before, after, during. We'd love to hear what you have to say. We're also on Facebook and LinkedIn. With that, let me introduce our speakers tonight. We have Michael Morell. Michael Morell is former Deputy Director of CIA and twice acting director during that time, after both the Petraeus tenure and after the Panetta tenure. He is currently a senior fellow here at the Hayden Center and is also a distinguishing visiting professor at the Schar School, teaching graduate level courses on intel analysis, one of the more popular classes we offer. And Michael does consulting work at Beacon Global Strategies for those who might be interested in hearing from him in a more professional venue. Our guest tonight is Congressman Adam Schiff. Thank you, Congressman, for joining us. Many of Americans know you mainly as that guy that ran that first impeachment of Donald J. Trump about a year ago. And but we in the intel business have known you for a long time. Congressman Schiff joined the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence in 2007. He had been the ranking member of the committee beginning in 2015 and became the chairman in 2019. He represents California's 28th congressional district, which covers a significant part of Los Angeles County, home to much of the entertainment industry. So he's a strong advocate for intellectual property and digital privacy. It's also home to the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, which has had this wonderful success in the last week with the Perseverance rover sending wonderful pictures and videos from the planet Mars. So congratulations to your constituents there for doing that great work. And he's not always been a congressman. He spent time in the state Senate in California and was a federal prosecutor at the attorney's office in Los Angeles. Thank you for joining us. We're very eager to get started. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Michael.
Thank you, Larry. Congressman, it's great to see you again. And it's great that you could join us for this joint Hayden Center and CBS News Intelligence Matters podcast episode. It's sort of two birds with one stone. I really want to spend most of the evening, as I'm sure you do, looking forward rather than looking back. But I do want to ask a couple of questions about the last 4 years. We were chatting earlier and you used the word difficult. They were difficult 4 years for both the intelligence community and for the House Intelligence Committee. But I'm wondering, with regard to the intelligence community, if difficult equated to damage, right? Was there real damage done to the IC? If so, what was that? How much? And how do we fix it?
Thank you, Michael, for inviting me, and thanks for the question. Was there damage? I think the answer is yes. It was multifaceted damage. Probably the most serious damage was to the reputation of the community for essentially nonpartisan analysis. The workforce continued doing their job in a professional way, but at some of the very highest levels of the IC, including in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, you had appointed officials who were, I think, unquestionably politicizing the intelligence. And I think that they cultivated an environment at some of the agencies where the workforce had real concerns about whether an objective analysis would be welcome at the highest levels or whether it would be career ending. And often when intelligence was shared publicly, it was done so in a way to suit the narrative that the former president wished to tell, rather than a straight recitation of the facts. And so I think that was deeply damaging to the reputation of the intelligence community, to the functioning of the community. I think it also injured some of our relationships with our overseas partners who had profound concerns whether information they shared would be protected, whether information they shared would be politicized. There was at one point early in the last administration where some of our overseas partners were accused of spying on the then president of the United States. that does damage to our relationships. Now, as you know, Michael, those relationships are really strong. They have survived those trials, but we have work to do, I think, to rebuild within the community the understanding that the agencies need to speak truth to power, whether that's power in the executive or power in the Congress. As I would often communicate to my intelligence colleagues, I want you to tell me exactly what your best analysis is, whether you think I want to hear it or I don't. I'm counting on you to do that. And I know with the appointments that the Biden administration has made, that kind of independence will be restored. And I think it will help improve morale within the workforce. There's also been damage, I think, to the relationship between the intelligence committees on the Hill and the community. And I look forward to working to restore that. I'm in particular want to resurrect something I was doing prior to the last 4 years, which is doing some town halls within the IC. I enjoyed going over to the agency, for example, and doing a town hall with the workforce where, they got to ask me questions about what it's like testifying in Congress and what the members are thinking. And I remember one of the analysts asking me what keeps me up at night. And I thought, well, the fact you're asking me is going to keep me up at night. But I do think the damage that's been done can all be repaired. And I think given the caliber of people the Biden administration is bringing in at the very top, it can be repaired in short order.
There's one piece of damage that I'm worried about long term, which is because of the actions and words of Donald Trump for 4 years, there are many Americans who supported him who now see the IC as part of this, quote, deep state, right? Who see the IC not as a defender of America, but as an organization trying to undermine it, right? So how do we deal with that perception that's out there among some of our fellow citizens?
That's a really good point and a good question. That's going to be harder to overcome, and of course, it's not a problem confined to the IC. That kind of falsehood or myth has been propagated about the law enforcement community, about the State Department. And, it used to take the form of, complaints that any administration might have about the bureaucracy. But this deep state myth is deeply damaging. And I'm sure you recognize it, Michael. It's what we used to hear in other countries, often in third world countries that were really prone to conspiracy theories. I once went to Pakistan, and there was this conspiracy theory that I was John Negroponte, and I was there on a mission to try to change the judgments of the Pakistan Supreme Court in dealing with Musharraf. And I thought, my God, I'm glad we don't have those kind of crazy conspiracies at home. Well, now we do. Yeah. And I'm not sure there's a shortcut to that problem as long as I think Donald Trump is on the political scene. And given the fealty that Kevin McCarthy has now pledged to him, and Mitch McConnell, after that stirring speech he gave on the Senate floor about Trump's responsibility for the insurrection, pledged his support for Donald Trump should Donald Trump become the nominee. So I don't see a quick end to that problem particularly.
Congressman, you mentioned the new leadership in the IC. So we have Avril Haines as the DNI. We have David Cohen back as Deputy Director of CIA. Bill Burns yesterday had his confirmation hearing, and it appears an almost certainty that he will be confirmed by the Senate. Love to know your thoughts about these folks. Love to know about any interactions you've had so far and what you might have advised them.
I think they're all superb choices. I would love to see a Mike Morell having joined their company or join their company in the future. But as you know, these are really quality people. And I've had a chance to speak with all of them. I think they will put as priority number one, restoring that independence to the intelligence community. But I also like the decades of experience that Bill Burns brings in diplomacy. That's an interesting background to bring to the CIA. There are times, I think, where there's a tendency to think, particularly if you've grown up within the IC, that the IC is the answer to every problem. And, frankly, there are also a lot of people in the IC who recognize all too well it is not the answer to every problem, and have to tell presidents of the United States, you can't rely on the IC to do everything.
Right.
But I think that he will bring a very broad perspective of, here's the State Department's role, here's the Defense Department's role, here's USAID's role, here's the intelligence community role, and here's how we need to make sure all of these parts of the government are working together in pursuit of U.S. policy interests. So I'm, very excited about the experience he brings. And I think Dave and Avril have, such a background within the agency, but also with respect to terrorism finance, on cyber issues, a lot of, the real challenging issues of the day. So I have a lot of confidence in this group, and can't wait for them all to be seated. And I'm sure, judging from how well, the love fest with Bill Burns, that will happen soon.
Any idea when we might see a worldwide threat hearing?
That's one thing I brought up with each of these designees and appointees. The desire to go back to do those on a quarterly basis. They all committed to doing that. So I would imagine fairly soon. And that was a good indication, frankly. The cancellation of those open worldwide threats hearings was a pretty solid indication that the then leadership of the IC, whether it was Grinnell or Ratcliffe or others, were not willing to speak truth to power. To his credit, Dan Coates, when he was ODNI, spoke forthrightly, publicly, and what he said publicly was consistent with what he said privately. Now it ended up forcing him out of his position, but that's the responsibility you take on in leadership of these agencies. And if a president doesn't want that, then I think, frankly, you're better off leaving the administration. So I hope to have those worldwide threat hearings, open hearings, back on schedule shortly.
So for the committee, Congressman, you've said repeatedly that you want to get partisanship out of the committee. You want to get back to comity. I'm just wondering how you think you're doing in making progress on that. Do you think it's possible in this era to get politics out of there? How do you see the committee going forward?
Well, I certainly hope so. And I've already discussed this with a couple of my Republican colleagues on the committee, including the ranking member Nunes. I would like to get back to some level of comity. I realize it's going to take time. Frankly, within the Democratic caucus, there is continuing anger, among other emotions, over the fact that even after the failed insurrection, so many of our Republican colleagues were back on the House floor trying to overturn the results of the election and propagating the same falsehoods that led to that attack on the Capitol. Most of the Republicans on the Intelligence Committee are among that group. But nonetheless, the work of the committee has to get done. And so I've been talking to Republican members about trying to reset. I will say that, and this is a kind of an untold story of the House Intel Committee, even over the last 4 years, where it was so acrimonious on our committee, we nonetheless got the Intelligence Authorization Acts done every year. And so we were able to compartmentalize. But what I have urged in the past, and I will urge again, is even in those areas where we disagree, whether it was the Russia investigation, the Ukraine investigation, the investigation we're undertaking now into politicization of intelligence at the Department of Homeland Security, let's at least keep those differences within civil limits. And that's my hope. I'm going to do my part. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle we'll have to decide whether they're interested in that. I can't do it for both sides, so I hope they will take me up on it.
I'm wondering if China, given the importance of China, given that everybody agrees this is the challenge of the moment, that could be something that people can rally around and agree on and work together on.
Without a doubt, and indeed, in the last 2 years of Devin Nunes' chairmanship, they did a focus on China. In the first 2 years of my chairmanship, I did a focus on China. And we produced I think, very well-received report on China and how the Intelligence Committee really needed to reposition itself to deal with the challenge of China. We obviously, and for understandable reasons, have devoted so much within the IC to dealing with the counterterrorism threat, and at the same time have really not sufficiently addressed the rise of China and the extraordinary challenge and threat China poses in practically every field of domain, on the seas, on land, in space, in the cyber realm, and a particular interest and concern of mine. Indeed, the very first hearing I had 2 years ago as chairman of the Intel Committee was on authoritarianism and how China was exporting its digital totalitarian model with its ubiquitous CCTV camera, its Orwellian named Safe Cities Initiative, its use of big data analytics, and this was every bit as much of a threat to democracy globally as anything the Russians were doing.
So I want to ask you about some priorities. And I want to start with China. So it's a great transition. And I want to start with the report that your committee put out, which I thought was terrific and which was bipartisan. It was quite critical of the IC. It said, let me quote here, the IC requires a significant and immediate reprioritization and realignment of resources to meet the threat from Beijing. The report did not come out directly and say that our collection wasn't what it should be, but you could kind of read that between the lines. The report had over 100 recommendations. I'm wondering, how did the IC react to that? Have they made any progress? And what do you consider to be the most important of those recommendations?
I think the IC reacted very responsibly and respectfully. And I think it is receptive to the recommendations that we made. I thought it was interesting in the executive summary that the most redacted part of the summary was part of our recommendations, which I took it to mean they thought those were areas where they needed improvement. It wasn't meant to be a criticism as much as it was meant to be constructive and to, just recognize the reality of the changing world circumstances. The counterterrorism threat, the terrorism threat has not gone away. We're just going to have to be more efficient in how we address it because the threat from China is so elevated, and they are a very worthy rival in so many ways. I think that in terms of prioritizing the recommendations, it's difficult to be specific since some of them I can't go into, but we need to make sure, and this is kind of a cross-cutting challenge that IC has always had, that we have the personnel that understand the China problem set, that have the linguistic skills. It is not sufficient to simply have China expertise in a mission focused on China. It needs to really be diffused throughout the IC so that when you're looking at particular problem sets, there are people within those parts of the agencies with expertise about China. I think one of the other big challenges we have, and this is, again, not a criticism, but a reflection of Chinese technological sophistication, that the operating environment within China has become so difficult.
Right.
Not just in China. It's become more difficult everywhere. You add to that the extraordinary and tragic success of Chinese espionage in terms of stealing data from US agencies and private sector entities. The Chinese ability to assimilate that data to try to identify who works in the IC and who doesn't work in the IC. The problem of digital dust in an increasingly digital world. And it just goes to underscore the breadth and depth of the challenges. So that requires a kind of a whole of government, but a whole of IC effort to meet that challenge. And we are up to it. But it will require changing the direction of that big aircraft carrier that we call the IC.
Would you say that China is the biggest national security challenge that you've seen in your lifetime?
Well, I'm old enough as you are to remember the Soviet Union. So I don't know that I would say in my lifetime, but I would say that the danger from Russia, which is a declining power, is the danger that you face from a wounded animal that is dangerous because it's wounded and desperate. And Russia very much sees the world in a zero-sum game with the United States. But China is on the rise, and China is already formidable. It used to be not that long ago that the way Americans viewed China was they're good at copying our technology, they're good at copying our innovation, they're good at stealing our intellectual property. They're not so good at developing their own. We pointed to our education system as a part of the reason why that China was producing individuals that were more inclined to groupthink than innovation. That was probably an inaccurate stereotype in the past. It's certainly not an apt description in the present. China is a real innovator in every field of domain, and so it's also clear that while China historically was focused in an inward direction, they are increasingly focused in an outward direction. They are increasingly self-confident and increasingly willing to challenge the United States and regional powers in the South China Sea and elsewhere. So I think that over time, China will only continue to eclipse the threat we face from other places. That's not to obviously diminish the threat posed by Iran and North Korea, but there's no other country that poses such an across-the-board challenge as China.
Congressman, the second issue I wanted to ask you about is your committee's doing a deep dive on the coronavirus pandemic and the IC's response to that, reporting on it, et cetera. And so I want to kind of take that and ask kind of a broad question here about sort of non-traditional intelligence topics. So, global health, climate change. How do you think about the IC's role in those kinds of issues? How do you think about the IC's responsibilities versus the responsibilities of other government agencies? How do you think about that?
Yeah, those are exactly the right questions. And, we've been having an internal debate about this, a debate at times between the parties on the committee, a debate sometimes within our party as well. For years, as we have tried to prioritize these, what were called soft threats. And it's been a struggle when it came to climate change, for example. We have created, a center to focus on that issue, but it's one of the areas where every year in the Intelligence Authorization Act, we have a fight over climate. The reality is, and it should be just obvious, climate's having effect, for example, in sea lanes in the Arctic, opening up new possibilities for the Chinese Navy, for the Russian Navy. Resource scarcity in Yemen creates additional national security threats for the United States. The fact that, some of our naval bases are underwater and not in a good way is a national security issue and an intel issue. So there's no question that climate is having an impact on our security, and that keeping an eye to those impacts and where they will aggravate dangers to the country is an important IC responsibility. But if anything brought home or should have brought home the need to pay attention to some of these non-traditional threats is the pandemic. And with the pandemic, we continue to have an internal debate as part of the deep dive we're doing on what's the IC's role, what's the IC's lane, how do we make sure there's the kind of collaboration between the intelligence community and the public health community and other parts of the US government and international organizations to deal with pandemic threats. I think one thing is certain, the IC has an important role to play. And that role, for example, can be in early detection of potential pandemics when host governments may not be interested in transparency, in fact, may be affirmatively trying to hide the magnitude of a problem. And just to allude to public reporting, there's public reporting about how crowded hospitals in Wuhan were, what the parking lots look like. Well, you can see parking lots from space, and if you have good enough AI and you've got good enough analysts and good enough tipping and queuing, you can look for the signs of potential health crises and pandemics, and as well to learn of how governments are responding and how a problem may be migrating. So there is definitely an intelligence community lane here, but at the same time, we have to be careful that agencies that we need to work with on the global stage aren't going to view with suspicion our health agencies with the false impression that they are now intelligence agencies. Again, referring to public reporting, for example, about the search for bin Laden, there's public reporting without commenting on whether it's accurate or not, because frankly, it doesn't matter whether it's accurate or not at one level, that a vaccination program may have played a role. If there is an intermingling between health issues and intelligence community issues, it can end up degrading an important healthcare effort. So we are in this deep dive trying to figure out how is the IC resourced to focus on this problem set. We have 500,000 Americans dead. Had that been the result of a terrorist attack, you can imagine the analysis that we would be undergoing to figure out why wasn't the IC better able to thwart this? And I think it's appropriate to do the same analysis while recognizing the IC is only one part of the tripwire. This gets to another issue, Michael, that you've been deeply involved in, and that is we need to make good use of open source information, because some of the best early information on the pandemic was open source information. So what we hope to do is, look at, for example, the National Medical Unit within DoD that has a seminal role in pandemic ascertainment is very small, and it's in DoD. Now, that may have made sense when health threats like a pandemic were viewed through a defense prism. Does it still make sense? And so those are the issues that we're looking at and the questions we're trying to answer.
I know that that I agree 100% with you on open source. Somehow we have to get people in the IC to believe that just because something's not stamped top secret, right, or secret, that it's somehow not as important, right? I think that's a cultural issue we have to get over.
You're absolutely right, and it's kind of the flip side in a way of the problem we were talking about earlier in what a difficult operating environment China is now, because of all the private data that they have stolen and their sophistication in terms of technology. There's also now tremendous amounts of open source information. If we know how to look for it, if we know how to find the needles in the huge haystack, and one of the things that we're trying to determine there is how is open source treated within the intelligence community? Is there a center of excellence, or do we have a lot of jack of all trades and master of none? So those are some questions we're trying to answer also.
The third issue, Congressman, I wanted to raise was solar winds. As you know, devastating hack. Nobody's talked about it this way, but I'm wondering to what extent, did the IC miss this? At some point, the Russians were obviously, if it was the Russians were planning this. At some point, they began preparations. They carried out those preparations. They carried out the attack. Shouldn't CIA, NSA, others have seen that? How do you think about that question?
Yeah. Well, I think that I guess I would say a couple of things. First of all, there's only so much that we can do with our cyber capability to ascertain what our foreign adversaries are doing. So if we're always going to count on the IC to see what our adversaries are doing and stop it before they succeed, we're going to have a lot of failures and costly failures. We are going to have to up our game in terms of looking at what the Russians and other bad actors are doing and how they're doing it to try to guard against things like solar winds. But that's only one piece of the puzzle. We're going to have to be much better at defense. And here, I think the IC was aware there was a real vulnerability when it came to the supply chain. But not enough was done, I think, within the IC and outside the IC. Not enough has been done in the private sector to shore up and secure the supply chain. And in particular, as we see with solar winds, when a supply chain vendor who supplies a product that's important to a lot of operating systems sends something that they've authenticated but encrypted, it's a really difficult problem set. And so we've been aware of the problem. It's not like it's a surprise, but we haven't obviously done what needed to be done to guard against it. And we're going to have to, and we're going to have to figure out, well, what does this mean in terms of how actively involved the IC needs to be in the work of the vendors? What kind of disclosure requirements do we need to make of the private sector when there have been infiltrations and problems? You probably saw the comments of Microsoft's COO, the testimony recently that they're being transparent, but the intimation was there are other companies that have decided not to because it's not good for business to admit that you've been successfully hacked in any way. And so Senator Warner, I think, has proposed something like the kind of entity and review after a plane crash to determine what went wrong. And I like that concept very much, so that there is a independent analysis and corrective action taken. We're also going to have to, decide what part of the supply chain do we need to bring in-house, and of course look at the whole other aspect of supply chain problems in supplies that we obtain from overseas. So big problem, yes, big failure in terms of the intelligence community, the private sector. The fact, frankly, we had to learn about this from the private sector is also, I think, deeply embarrassing to the intelligence community. So we have a lot of work to do.
And then the last specific issue I wanted to ask you about is domestic terrorism. So you have been the victim of domestic terrorism. And I'm wondering how you think about the IC's role in domestic terrorism, if any, given Fourth Amendment concerns.
And actually, given you raised the Fourth Amendment issue, let me make one other observation about solar winds. And here, again, referring to public reporting. But if public reporting is accurate that the Russians took advantage of utilizing U.S. facilities to mount part of its cyber attack, knowing that the authorities we can use domestically are much more limited than the authorities we can use internationally, then we have to figure out that problem too. In terms of the domestic terrorism threat and the IC role, clearly there's an intelligence community role when there is a foreign component, foreign support of domestic bad actors. There's also an intelligence community role through the Department of Homeland Security at the FBI in terms of sharing the information that it obtains with law enforcement authorities and making sure that it's done in a timely way, that the intelligence is shared in a form where it will be paid attention to. And on the basis of the public testimony thus far, we can see there are real issues and discrepancies about what was the quality state of the intelligence, how much of it was shared. If it was it shared in a format where it was sounding the alarm, or was it shared in the format of, well, we can find a document we sent to you, so you should have paid attention to it. We're doing an investigation in our committee, working in concert with other committees to determine how much of this was a failure to gather the right intelligence, how much was it a failure to share that intelligence, and how much of it was a failure to act on that intelligence. I won't be surprised if there's responsibility to be attributed at every stage of the process, but the intelligence community does, consistent with our domestic authorities and constitutional requirements, have a role. But it is not the paramount role, but it is an important one.
Maybe the last issue we can talk about before we go to questions is this whole idea of the IC and technology. And one of the ways I think about it is there's kind of three things we have to get right. One is we have to collect on and understand where our adversaries are with regard to technological advancements, right? Two is we have to use technology to do a better job ourselves in the IC. And then three, we have to protect ourselves, right, against the technology that our adversaries are using against us and the operations that we're conducting. And I think you would agree that we need to be on the cutting edge, right, and stay there. And I know you agree with that. How far do we have to go to get there? Are we moving? Are we moving fast enough? Do we have to think about new approaches? Do we have to think about new approaches to the government working with the private sector? How do you think about that big problem?
Yeah. Well, I think we are on the cutting edge. I don't think we're playing catch up in that respect. Now, there are other countries like China that are ahead in certain areas, but frankly, I think we still maintain the technological advantage. But the delta is narrowing. So I think that China is making rapid gains. And if we don't make a renewed investment in research and development, and here I'm speaking not just of the IC, but as a nation, then we will be eclipsed. And that will have, I think, catastrophic repercussions for us and for the free world. Because we really are in a new battle of ideas, not communism versus capitalism, as much as it is authoritarianism versus democracy. And so we can't keep kicking immigrants out of our country who get advanced degrees from Caltech in STEM fields. That's economic and national security suicide. We can't keep underinvesting in science and technology and research and development, either in the public or private sector. In the private sector, this chase for quarterly profits, in which companies aren't incentivized to invest in the long term in their research and development, and we've seen a real and precipitous decline in the investment, corporate investment in R&D, is catastrophic. One of the profound issues I think that we need to grapple with, and it's exemplified by Huawei and ZTE, is how does the United States compete with China when China is willing to put billions in a state-run enterprise, is willing to essentially be a loss leader underprice the global market, drive competition out of the market, and then enjoy a monopoly on a technology that is a critical technology, like 5G. It's very hard, we have found, in pushing back against Huawei, to compete with something with nothing. When we've had these conversations, as I've had with our European partners and others about the security risks that are present in a technology like Huawei's 5G, their response is, what's your alternative? And I do think that it's going to force us to, really grapple with a big question that we haven't had to probably since we felt challenged by the Japanese model in the 90s. And that is, do we need to explore a different kind of public-private partnership to compete in certain critical technologies to make sure that we always have an American alternative? So those conversations are happening. I think they're still at a very nascent stage, and they need to happen much quicker.
Congressman, let's turn to audience questions. But this is where the podcast will end. So thank you for joining us on Intelligence Matters. It's great to have you back again. Let me take the first question here. The IC probably tomorrow is going to release a report. I guess the Biden administration is going to release a report redacted on the 2018 murder of Jamal Khashoggi. If the media is right about the key judgments, the key judgment will be that Mohammed bin Salman, Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, approved the killing. You were among those that pushed for the release of this. Why did you think that that was important? And what would you like the Biden administration to do with it from a policy perspective?
Yeah. Well, thank you for the question. I did push for it. Years ago, I started a bipartisan, bicameral caucus on freedom of the press with a fellow freshman, a backbencher named Mike Pence. And for the last 15 or 20 years, freedom of the press issues have been, very near and dear to my heart. And it's hard to imagine a more chilling crime than the murder and dismemberment of a journalist. And so I was particularly aghast at the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And I think part of holding Saudi Arabia accountable is publicly attributing the actors responsible for that murder. And so, without commenting on the report that is soon to be released, if it does show culpability by the Deputy Crown Prince, there need to be serious repercussions. Now, frankly, many of the things that we've been advocating prior to now, the Biden administration is already implementing in terms of cutting off support for the war in Yemen, cutting off arms sales to Saudi Arabia, and putting human rights back center stage in our relationship with Saudi Arabia. But I think that with the publication of this report, it'll be important to go further. And this is something that I've had a chance to discuss with Director Haynes, and obviously there are elements of the relationship that will remain important in terms of the joint counterterrorism work, in terms of pushing back against Iran's malign conduct. So I'm not advocating we have no relationship with the kingdom, but if this is going to be a leadership that murders journalists, that hunts down dissidents, that locks up members of the press, and of course there are public reports also of Saudi hit squads trying to track down other dissidents. If the kingdom is going to imprison family members of people overseas that are espousing views they don't like, then we really have to wonder whether the price of the relationship is just too high.
Another question here. Person notes that at the confirmation hearing yesterday of Ambassador Burns, that he was asked about these attacks on both diplomats and intelligence officers overseas that have caused, serious injuries that have never gone away. People are wondering, or this questioner is wondering, if we know as a government what caused the attacks and who did it, and do we need to do a better job taking care of the people who were injured?
Well, on the last question, absolutely. We need to do a much better job. And I think there are real flaws with how and I'll say broadly here, the community in terms of our diplomats and others overseas have been treated or not treated when it comes to these injuries. In terms of what we know, there is still a lot we don't know. And I can't go into a lot of the specifics, but there is still a lot more hard work I think we need to do to understand what's happened to our workforce and how to protect people going forward. Because unless we can make public attribution of who's responsible, unless we can take protective measures against further repetition of these kind of attacks, we can expect them to proliferate. Wherever our adversaries don't want us to have a diplomatic or intel presence, then they may view this as a good tactic with a lot of deniability. So we have more hard work to do, I think, in terms of our understanding of what's gone on and how to protect the workforce. And immediately, we need to make sure that that everyone gets the help, the treatment, and support they need.
Question: Do you intend to look into the findings of the IC Analytic Ombudsman report on politicization and intelligence that was sent to the Congress on January 6th? The questioner says that the SSCI is already investigating. Will you as well?
We have been undertaking an investigation of precisely these issues for months now, and that will continue. In particular, and I can talk about because it's public. We've been looking at whistleblower allegations that within the Department of Homeland Security, there were any number of efforts to politicize the intelligence. Everything from allegations that the threat at the southern border was hyped in order to justify the wall, the threat of terrorism that is from the southern border, to a sort of an edict or an ethic within DHS intelligence unit that the threat of Antifa should be hyped and the threat of white nationalist terror should be diminished. And other allegations of a serious nature regarding potential abuse of intelligence resources to monitor protesters in Portland. So we're looking at that series of allegations. But whenever there are credible allegations of politicization within the IC, it's among our highest priorities to investigate.
Question is, can you please comment on whether you think the House Armed Services Committee's Subcommittee on National Intelligence infringes on your turf?
It's an interesting, very timely question because Adam Smith and I just got together today to talk about how do we coordinate between our two committees so that, where appropriate, Chairman Smith can gain access to information about intelligence within the military domain, and where I and others on HPSI can gain the information we need about special operations where intel is implicated, or in the cyber realm or the space realm or elsewhere, where there's an overlap of authorities and a need to know. And so we are in discussions to try to make sure that that information is shared where that's appropriate to do so. I think a challenging area for every committee. Nothing prompts fights on the Hill more than turf. But what we're committed to doing is working together at the level of chair to chair and at the level of staff to staff to try to make sure that where there is an appropriate need to know that members can get the information they need. But nonetheless, we obviously protect classified information and make sure that it's only shared where necessary.
This is an important question. This comes from somebody who actually works in the Inspector General community, and they're wondering if there's any legislation planned to protect Inspector Generals from retaliation by an administration.
Yes, and in fact, one of the reasons why the Intel authorization bill was so hard to pass last year, and last year was frankly the most difficult year we had in the House Intelligence Committee, is because I and the Democratic members were insistent on including protections for inspector generals and whistleblowers within the IC. Now, the ranking member and Republicans were insistent in the House not including that. And frankly, on the Senate side, Senate Intel Republicans also took a dim view of those provisions. So they were stricken from the bill in order to get the bill passed. But we will be back trying to enact those provisions. And now with Democratic majorities in both houses, I'm hoping that we can do so. But quite separate apart from the IGs and whistleblower protections within the IC, I introduced legislation about 4 months ago or 5 months ago called the Protecting Our Democracy Act that I worked on with several other chairs and with the speaker. And it's probably the most comprehensive set of pro-democracy reforms since Watergate. It would do things like expedite the enforcement of congressional subpoenas, stiffen the penalties for violation of the Hatch Act, provide an enforcement mechanism for violations of the Emoluments Clause, discourage abuse of the pardon power, protect the independence of the Justice Department. But it also has very broad protections for inspector generals, for whistleblowers, prevents retaliation against whistleblowers. And it's my hope that we can also move that package. I would say also, and only time will tell, when Trump was in office, it was difficult to get Republicans to support those things, which frankly, in the pre-Trump world would have been consensus items for people on both sides of the aisle. Inspector General protections, whistleblower protections were consensus bipartisan policy matters before Donald Trump. Now, during Donald Trump, the Republicans on our committee viewed it as a poison pill, as an implicit criticism of Donald Trump, which they could not afford to support. Now that he's no longer president, I hope that they will go back to the GOP of old that supported things like whistleblower protections and the independence of inspector generals. But as Donald Trump has not disappeared from the scene, that may be optimistic. And we will soon test that proposition. But I would hope that we can go back to those being bipartisan priorities.
So we have a lot of students tuning in tonight, and this is a question from one of them, which is, what advice would you give to students who want to enter the IC? And I love this part. Is there advice that you would give to your younger self?
Well, first of all, I would strongly encourage you to pursue a career in the IC. There's nothing that's been more interesting, more rewarding and challenging in my career than the work I've done with the IC. Nothing that's been more inspiring than in particular when I have a chance to visit professionals within the IC at home and around the world to see the extraordinary work they're doing, the courage they display, often operating without a safety net around the world. And so you couldn't choose a more interesting rewarding and I think important career. So I would strongly encourage you. The next thing I would say that's related to the first, and it's advice that I would give my younger self, except that my father gave it to me already. So I had that advice, and I'd like to think I followed that advice. My father told me when I was a kid, if you're good at what you do, there will always be a demand for you, which I found to be a very liberating idea, because then you just needed to focus on trying to be good at what you did. But you could follow your passion. And this is what I would advise, which is if you have a love and fascination and interest in intelligence issues, national security issues, foreign policy issues, in the world at large, and being a force for good in the world, then follow that passion. You can not only make a living doing it, but you can have a wonderful, interesting, challenging, rewarding living at the same time. And, I think life's too short to do anything you don't love. So that would be my advice to my younger self. It's my advice to my current self, and very much was my advice from my parents.
Yeah, that's great advice. Question here on the investigation into the events of January 6th, and whatever form that takes, right? Commission or what have you. The question is, how do we make sure that investigation is nonpartisan? And how do we make sure that investigation is perceived to be nonpartisan, given that whatever the judgments of the investigation, and whatever the findings of the investigation are so important to the country?
Yeah. Well, it's very difficult. I remember at the very first hearing of the Russia investigation, in which James Comey testified for the first time in open hearing that the FBI was doing an investigation into the Trump campaign and its connections to Russia, a counterintelligence investigation. I remember in my opening statement during that hearing saying that I hope that we could do a bipartisan, indeed nonpartisan investigation, and reach a common conclusion that if we did our own separate reports at the end of the day, it would be of little value because people would read the report they wanted to believe. But that I didn't know if it would be possible, but I knew that it would be in the public interest if we could. Now, that didn't prove possible. Indeed, within 24 hours of that opening statement, our then chairman was off to the White House in what became known as the Midnight Run. But I believe now, as I believed then, that if we can do this in a bipartisan fashion, that's the way it will have real value. For this reason, I think we shouldn't put all our eggs in the congressional basket. And I do think we should have a 9/11-like commission that can be ruthlessly nonpartisan. And it will be really important who gets appointed to that commission. One of the reasons why the 9/11 Commission was so impactful was not just because of how the legislation was written, but because those that did the appointing and those that were given the responsibility recognized the need to do it in a nonpartisan way. And so that's what we need to do here. In terms of what we're doing in Congress, this is not only important with respect to the look backward at January 6th, but the look forward. There was a national threat assessment that many of you may have seen, it became public, the National Threat Assessment for Law Enforcement, that talked about, after January 6th, the continuing threat of domestic terrorism from those who were aggrieved at the outcome of the 2020 election, those who are upset about COVID restrictions, and those who are upset about police violence. Now, it lumped those three very disparate groups together. And I have to say that reading it that way made me wonder whether this was being done because it was too politically sensitive to highlight the paramount threat which comes from white nationalist domestic terror. For those of you that follow these issues so carefully and have over the last several years, you'll know that I raised concerns during the Trump administration with efforts to de-emphasize, in my view, the ODNI's statements about Russian interference in our election by hyping the threat from China, Iran, at times Nicaragua, or God knows where else. Yeah, there may be threats from a variety of nations. They're not all the same. And in lumping them together, because at the time it was viewed as too sensitive to highlight where the predominant threat came from because the president wouldn't like it, it's misleading to the country. And so, I frankly worried when I read that national threat assessment, is this the same thing happening in terms of threat of domestic terror? And so we need to make sure that we're analyzing the problem correctly, that we're speaking about it plainly, because otherwise we can't respond in the way we need to.
Someone asking for you to comment on how Congress and the administration can work to prevent the erosion of democracy and human rights around the world, given that erosion can lead to national security challenges for us.
Well, this is, as I mentioned earlier, a topic that I feel keenly about and have for many years. And it comes from an abiding conviction that democracies pose less of a threat to us than autocracies, and that we have a very proud legacy of supporting democracies, fellow democracies around the world. Now, it's not an unblemished record, certainly, and you can point out a lot of terrible failures to live our values in our past, including within the IC. In deposing the Iranian prime minister in favor of the Shah, just to cite one example. So we've not always lived our ideals, but we do have a cherished legacy as a beacon of liberty. And we do so because it's consistent with our values, but we also do it because it's consistent with our interests. One of the things I think that has been so destructive over the last 4 years is this effort to tear down the international rules-based order, which I think is inherently supportive of freedom and human rights, at least it should be. This fondness, fascination, at times debasement of our country before autocrats and dictators like Putin or Xi Jinping. I'm thrilled to see such a rapid change in the Biden administration. I can't tell you what a thrill it was to read the readout of President Biden's first conversation with Vladimir Putin. The fact that, first of all, that wasn't the first conversation he had with a world leader, that he talked to our allies first, but that it was exactly the kind of conversation a US president should have, taking the Russian leader to task on a host of its malign activities, including interference in our elections, its support of terrorists in Syria, its legal occupation of Crimea. The list goes on, but nonetheless, recognizing there are some shared interests like New START. That's exactly the kind of conversation we should have with Vladimir Putin. And the conversation that President Biden had with the Saudi king, I think, is also enormously important because human rights was very much on the agenda. We are going to have to stare down for some time accusations of hypocrisy. We've had a president for 4 years who described the press as the enemy of the people, who tried to use our justice system, our Justice Department, to reward friends and punish enemies. It wasn't without a lot of consternation on the anniversary of Tiananmen Square that, we put out statements about the Chinese government's need to be honest and forthright about its history and about what took place then, considering what was taking place in our own country. And you can imagine the difficulty my Republican colleagues had in condemning the coup in Myanmar, given that it was based on bogus claims of election fraud in Myanmar, which were very much a mirror image of bogus claims of election fraud in the United States of America. So, we very much need to lead by our example. I think the Biden administration is off to a tremendous start. And I think that we can burnish our image over time, but it will take time. And for the foreseeable future, there will be a worry around the world that the United States is not a reliable partner on human rights, that the virus that took hold over the last 4 years may recur. And only time and consistency, I think, will dispel that.
I think Larry's going to pop in here.
Yes, I am. Thank you, Michael. Great job moderating. Chairman Schiff, that was more than we ever could have asked for. Thank you very much. I know we have an audience out here that was very thirsty for the information you were sharing. As Michael will attest, he probably left a long list of questions on the floor there, and he was getting the questions we curated from an even longer list. So we had a very engaged audience, which says to me that there's a lot of Americans out there who want to hear this substantive conversation. They want to get away from the politics. So thank you very much for the time you gave us tonight, and for frankly all the great public service you've been affording the nation as well. Michael, Chairman.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me tonight. Thank you for the great questions, and really appreciate the public service that you all perform in hosting these kind of discussions. And I do want to say to Director Hayden how wonderful it is to see you, and how greatly appreciative I am of your leadership.
Mark, last thoughts.
Oh, I just want to say thank you again, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Larry, for leading us off. And Michael Morell, we look forward to the broadcast on your program as well, on your podcast later on. So when is that going to be presented?
Next Wednesday. Next Wednesday.
Oh.
Next Wednesday.
Next Wednesday. So everybody knows. Great. Thank you. And General Hayden.
I just said thank you again. Thank you again. Thank you.
All right. Good night to everybody. Thank you for
Good night.
joining the Hayden Center.
Good night, everyone.
Take
Good night,
care.
everybody.
Bye-bye.